Hi, I'm Megan, a bookseller at Literati bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we're pleased to welcome Zoë Playdon to our At Home with Literati series in support of The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes and the Unwritten History of the Trans Experience. For attendees, the chat is closed, but I'll be dropping links to purchase The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature in your toolbar to submit questions at any time. I ask a selection of them at the conclusion of the event. A reminder that you can shop for more books in-store at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. And now allow me to introduce tonight's author. Zoë Playdon is the Emeritus Professor of Medical Humanities at the University of London, and a council member of the Association for Medical Humanities. She holds 5 degrees, including 2 doctorates. Zoë is a former co-chair of the Gay and Lesbian Association of Doctors and Dentists, GLAD, and co-founded the Parliamentary Forum on Gender Identity in 1994. She has 30 years experience of frontline work in LGBTI human rights, including supporting and advising on UK and European legal cases. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Zoë.
Thank you, Megan. I'll just share my screen and see if that works. Yes. Okay, so The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes. So the story of The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes starts here in the High Court of Justice in London in February 1996. We'd brought a judicial review of the right of trans people to correct their birth certificate and had shown evidence that trans people had corrected birth certificates in the past without difficulty and argued that they should be able to do so now as a matter of, common sense and natural justice. But we'd lost and we didn't understand why. Then, that evening, a man called Terrence Walton got in touch. Terrence was a lawyer in the famous 1970 legal case Corbett versus Corbett, involving the trans model and actress April Ashley. And he said, everyone always blamed me and April for trans people not being able to correct birth certificates, but it wasn't our fault. Before they went into court, he said, they were taken into the judge's chambers and shown another, earlier case, told they couldn't refer to it, but everyone involved in it was sworn to secrecy, that now included them, and that all records of it had been removed from the public eye because, and I quote, there are some interests it's more important to protect than the rights of individuals. And he'd say no more than that. Well, you always try to avoid conspiracy theory when you're doing legal activism, but coming from such an authoritative source, that statement had to be checked out. I discussed it with colleagues, and we decided that it had to be a case involving primogeniture. This is an archaic British law that says some aristocratic titles can only be inherited by a man, never by a woman. Until 2013, the British monarchy was decided by primogeniture. It's a law that still exists, and it often governs big money and political power, since it can give the right to sit in Parliament in the House of Lords and govern. It also defines a complex international set of family relationships created by 1,000 years of carefully planned intermarriage, which wields huge influence. And the principle of primogeniture is considered to be a fundamental part, it's called the dignified part, of our unwritten British Constitution. So primogeniture is very big potatoes. We decided that if such a case existed, it could only be an aristocratic trans man, and that we should start by eliminating the people that we knew. One of my colleagues remembered Ewan Forbes, and they faxed through his obituary. On the face of it, it looked as if Ewan had been intersexed, having a natural biological variation of sex, and as though it would be easy to find his court case and eliminate it. And so began the hidden case of Ewan Forbes, because wherever I looked, Ewan wasn't there. His case wasn't in our law library at the University of London, nor in Scotland's Signet Library, nor in the Scottish Records Office. I wrote to the Home Office and to the Lord Advocate, the head of law in Scotland, and neither of them replied. But my old history teacher from school turned up a little item in the Glasgow Herald that gave me a date for the case. And the Member of Parliament with whom I'd co-founded the Parliamentary Forum on Gender Identity wrote to the Lord Advocate. The first reply said there were no records of the case. The second reply said, well, there were records, but the Lord Advocate didn't feel it appropriate to release them to a Member of Parliament. In the end, it took 2 years and the direct intervention of the Home Secretary for the case records to be released. And here they are. 500 pages of verbatim transcript of a trial that took place over 4 days in May 1967, together with the judge's decision. So the short story is that until the 1960s, trans people self-identified, received affirmative medical care, corrected their birth certificates, and lived in complete equality. After 1970, trans people could no longer correct their birth certificates, had their civil liberties removed, were socially excluded, and subjected to a brutal medical regime that included compulsory sterilisation. The tipping point for this change was the hidden case of Ewan Forbes. Ewan was born in 1912, the youngest child of the aristocratic Scottish Forbes Semple family. They were not grand, they weren't dukes or marquises, but they were very distinguished because their titles were amongst the oldest in Scotland, and the family had a long history of service to and friendship with the Crown. Ewan's grandfather had been an intimate friend of Queen Victoria, his mother was a close friend of Queen Mary, and his father was aide-de-camp to King George V. They had a 20,000-acre estate with a mansion at Fintry. This is the Fintry House there, their mansion. And on the other side of their 20,000-acre estate is a castle at Craigovar, 24 miles away. So this is a really serious piece of property. The mansion's gone now. It was badly damaged after the family gave it over as a hospital for British troops during World War II, but the castle's still one of the most iconic buildings in Scotland, now under the management of the National Trust for Scotland. Here are Ewan's parents, his mother Gwendolyn and his father John, in a photograph taken outside the castle door at Craigovar, and next to it is John with his oldest son, little William, stood on a chair, flanked by his grandfather. This is the intimate friend of Queen Victoria, always known as Old Sir Wally. And as was the Scottish way, the family had very close, friendly relationships with their staff and tenants. English aristocrats could be pretty standoffish. In Scotland, the staff and tenants were regarded as part of the extended family. And here they are in the photograph. There, on the front line, is baby Ewan. On one side is his brother, William, just there, who's 19 years older than baby Ewan, who's sitting on Nanny's lap. And on the other side is his sister, Margaret, who was 7 years older than him and just about to be sent away to boarding school. And both William and Margaret are going to play a part in Ewan's story. So this is the setting where Ewan grew up. The entrance hall of Fintry Manor and its staircase were similarly larger than life. And each Christmas, it was turned into the stage for an impromptu pantomime in which everyone joined, family, guests, staff. And it's here that we meet Ewan as a child. His back is to the stairs and he's standing between two young girls. Little Ewan. He's standing between two young girls, one with a crown, one with a hat. Ewan's bareheaded, his hair brushed back from a high forehead, and his gaze direct and quizzical. And his face is thinner, I think, than the other children, making him seem frailer, but his chin is tilted defiantly upwards. And he's wearing some kind of ornate tunic, making him sort of an androgynous figure in comparison with the girls in their frocks who frame him. At the rear of the photograph, in the centre there, stands, this is his sister Margaret, dressed as Britannia, with a trident, helmet and Union flag shield, so we think this is probably celebrating Britain's victory at the end of World War I, probably taken in Christmas 1918, and so Ewan would have been just about 6. His brother William isn't there. By the end of the war, he'd become a colonel in the New Royal Air Force, and Ewan will have missed him, because one of his earliest memories was of William arriving in uniform on a motorcycle to visit the family, and he grew up hero worshipping him. But their father, the Lord Semple, is at hand. He's sat there at the front in this elaborate robe with a false pigtail and a kind of looking like a pantomime Aladdin. And this is their mother, Gwendolen, looking pretty tired of the whole affair. She's probably been organising it all day. So there's big age differences here between the kids. Margaret and William grow up with their own particular interests. Margaret raised and bred Shetland ponies. William was a big leader in the airspace industry. But as Ewan grew up, it became clear to his mother that although he'd been assigned female at birth, he was definitely a boy. She let him dress and play as he liked at home, and instead of sending him to boarding school where he would have been treated as if he was a girl, she homeschooled him. And here at the back we see Ewan riding his pony Tommy for the journey from Craigavart to Fintry, with his sister Margaret in the foreground, settling her Pekingese dog in her pony cart, and their mother between them, driving a governess cart. And Gwendolen let Ewan fill his life with boisterous games, things he liked to do. He loved shooting with his air rifle, lassoing the cattle, taking the dogs to go ratting, fishing, organising wrestling matches with his cousins and local children. And we can guess that, like parents of trans children today, Ewan's mother was watching for the pattern of persistence, consistence, and insistence that characterises and defines a gender-creative child. And like the parents of trans children today, she was anxious that Ewan shouldn't go through the wrong puberty. But fortunately, there was medical help at hand for those that had the money and influence to access it. In 1886, this guy, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, had provided the first medical definition of being trans. And in 1919, Magnus Hirschfeld had opened his groundbreaking Institute of Sexual Sciences in Berlin. And by the 1920s, synthetic hormones were being produced by a new generation of endocrinologists. So there's help there, there's medical help there and experienced help too. So Gwendolen takes Ewan on a tour of all of the medical facilities available, disguising it as a European cultural tour, going to Austria, Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia and Paris. Ewan was a guinea pig for early preparations of testosterone. So by the time he was 17, now 1929, he was growing both chest and facial hair. And here we see Ewan just before his 21st birthday at the Lonnock Highland gathering, relaxed, friendly and happy. And here he is in full ceremonial dress, dancing the chartreuse. Now the problem that Ewan faced was that there was a price to pay for the remarkable support he had. Ewan's family was a focus of public attention, and his father had a strict code of honour that required public duties to be fulfilled. And Ewan was expected not to rock the boat. So, put it simply, on some formal social occasions, his parents gave Ewan no choice but to dress and appear in public as a girl, which, must have been utterly traumatic. Well, Ewan had an imaginative response to what we'd now regard as incredibly abusive treatment. He formed a Scottish country dancing group, the Dancers of Don, and always danced the male part, so that he could appear in public, as the man he knew himself to be. And here they are, dancing outside Bintry Manor. In February 1934, Ewan's father died. This is Ewan on the right there, the hands calmly folded in front of him, walking with his mother and sister before the funeral cortege. Ewan's brother, William, inherited the family's titles and estate, and Ewan followed his own ambition to become a doctor. In 1939, as World War II broke out, Ewan joined Aberdeen Medical School. A relatively mature student at 27 years old, but still, he did well. This is his photograph from his medical school yearbook, and on the other side of the image, there he is in surgery. But instead of becoming a surgeon, Ewan chose to become a family doctor in his local market town of Arford, where his former patients still recall him with great affection. And here he is, being jolly and friendly with a patient who's just reached 100 years old. And you get a sense of the real affection that his community felt for him. A lot of his patients were hill farmers living in isolated crofts, and Ewan's reputation was that he'd get to them no matter what the weather, whether by skis or snowshoes or horseback. Well, Ewan's mother died in 1944, and here's Margaret and Ewan carrying her ashes for interment at St Medon's Church. A few years later, Ewan fell in love and decided to marry. In 1952, he corrected his birth certificate, as trans people could in those days, and married Patty Mitchell, the daughter of a hill farmer. Ewan's patients had a collection for him and presented him and Patty with gifts, and they lived happily together until December 1965, when tragedy struck. There they are receiving the wedding gifts. And here's the tragedy. Ewan's brother William died, and the Forbes of Craigovar baronetcy became vacant. It was limited by primogeniture. Remember the law that says only men? Yeah? And it should have gone directly to Ewan. But a cousin turned up, John, determined to claim the title for himself. And there he is, looking burly and surly in the photograph on the right. And John was to prove completely remorseless. William was buried at the peaceful little church of Cushney with a simple stone memorial, and at the funeral, John made it known that he was going to claim the baronetcy. Ewan's first response was to try to appease him. He signed over the 20,000-acre estate and family jewels, paintings, and heirlooms to John in return for John not contesting the title. Now, why ever did he do that? And what was it that Ewan was scared of, we might ask? The answer is, Ewan was scared of these two men. In the US, Richard Green on the left and John Money on the right were at the forefront of a new pseudo-medicine which was busy recategorizing trans people. When Ewan corrected his birth certificate, being trans was categorized as an intersex condition, a natural variation of sex development. But a group of psychiatrists led by John Money and enthusiastically supported by Richard Green were busy recategorizing being trans as a mental illness. As a doctor, Ewan was aware of this new pseudo-medical trend, and he will have known that at the first gender identity clinic at the University of California, Los Angeles, trans people, gay men and lesbians were being cured so-called, with aversion therapy, ECT, frontal lobotomy, and psychotherapy. Now, in 1967, if any questions were raised about Ewan's status, then he could, as a trans man, he could find himself reclassified as a floridly psychotic lesbian, with a 2-year prison sentence for him and Patty for entering into a perjured marriage. Ewan would be struck off the medical register in disgrace and their lives ruined. So it was worth paying any price to avoid that. But what Ewan didn't know was that having taken the money, John had decided to continue claiming the baronetcy as well. Ewan and his sister Margaret were estranged. Here she is, centre in the photo, with her partner Joan behind her and the Queen Mother in front. Margaret was in financial difficulties, and John paid her to write a letter saying that to her certain knowledge, Ewan was and always had been female. This was devastating, and when he found out, Ewan was desperate. He reconciled with Margaret. She finally understood the seriousness of what she'd done and came over to Ewan's side, effectively destroying John's case. But before she could stand up in court and take back her letter and explain that she'd been paid to write it, driving along a road that she'd travelled hundreds of times before on her way to see Ewan, Margaret collided with a lorry and a car. She was killed instantly. So, on the 15th of May, 1967, Ewan and Patty went to court for a 4-day hearing. Absolutely desperate, his back against the wall and determined to protect Patty and his lives, Ewan had created an audacious, impossible defence. How he did that is too complicated to explain here. You'll have to read the book. But 3 years later, on the 4th of December 1968, Ewan won his case and succeeded to the baronetcy. And in so doing, he created a constitutional crisis. For you'll remember that Ewan's title was subject to primogeniture, and at that period, so was the crown. If a trans man could gain a primogeniture baronetcy, then a trans man could be king. And this caused a huge political problem. The focus of constitutional law is to secure succession to the throne. You have to be certain who the next monarch will be for political stability. But now, the heir apparent might have an older sibling, assigned female at birth, who's trans and claims the throne instead. Or the heir, assigned male at birth, might themselves be trans and no longer eligible. So something had to be done to solve the problem. The first thing was to prevent the decision being cited by other cases by binding everyone to secrecy and removing the case from the public records. The second thing was to create a new precedent. On the same day that Ewan went to court, the Honourable Arthur Corbett, son and heir of Lord Rowallan, filed a petition for divorce from the trans model and actress, April Ashley. Although April hadn't corrected her birth certificate, she and Arthur had gone through a ceremony of marriage. Their relationship hadn't worked. April was angry that Arthur hadn't given her the villa in Marbella that he'd promised, and on the advice of her solicitor, Terrence Walton, the man who informed me about Ewan's case, on the advice of Terrence, April had sued Arthur for maintenance. Now, Arthur could just have ignored April because there was no legal marriage between them. She hadn't corrected her birth certificate, and so she had no claim on him. But instead, he responded with a petition to divorce April on the grounds that she was and always had been male. And although Ewan and April didn't know it, on the 15th of May 1967, they were linked in a domino effect that would damage trans lives worldwide. Now, meanwhile, John Money and Richard Green had successfully imported their new pseudo-medical categorization of trans people as mentally ill. In July 1969, they used the first international symposium on gender identity in London as a takeover of NHS care and the psychopathologization of UK trans people. And this was the background to April and Arthur's divorce, the case known as Corbett versus Corbett, which solved the problem that Ewan had unintentionally created. And these are the events that my informant, April's solicitor, Terrence Walton, recounted in 1996. The judge ignored senior UK medical and scientific evidence to create a so-called sex test of his own, declaring trans people mentally ill and stripping them of their civil liberties. And subsequently, the decision in Corbett versus Corbett would become a super precedent, damaging trans lives in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and continental Europe, cited all over the world and outlawing a generation of trans people. In 1984, now an old man, Ewan wrote a slender memoir in which he made no mention of the trial or of the personal circumstances that had given rise to it. He died in September 1991, his body cremated and ashes scattered, and a quiet memorial service held for him at the little church where he'd been an elder. And in 1991 too, a trans woman we know only as P took employment with Cornwall County Council. The bullying and subsequent brutal dismissal she was subjected to was to lead to a landmark decision in the European Court of Justice, the first time anywhere in the world that discrimination against a trans person was outlawed. Like Ewan's, P's verdict took 3 years to reach. Here's the only photograph we have of her. So the hidden case of Ewan Forbes was the springboard for 26 years of the most horrific trans exclusion and a concerted attempt to eliminate trans people biologically, to outlaw them legally, and exclude them socially. The publicised case of April Ashley, Corbett versus Corbett, was used worldwide to damage trans people's lives. Trans people today are still fighting for the restoration of an equality that was formerly theirs without question. So in the UK today, this is the situation of trans people. Still organisationally psychopathologized by the NHS, because after all, trans healthcare is still inexplicably located in mental health services. Still subject to a list of legal exclusions and disclosures that affect no other British citizen, whether born here or naturalised. And you'll note that in that list of exclusions is inheritance of male primogeniture titles and estates. These are circumstances that Prime Minister Theresa May was in process of beginning to remedy, but with the change in Prime Minister Boris Johnson have come to an end, so that the LGBT action plan that was in place and running through was shelved by the current Prime Minister, and the LGBT advisory group was disbanded. Things have got really quite problematic in the last 2 years. Britain's become known internationally as Terf Island, since attacks by so-called trans-exclusionary radical feminists, TERFs for short, on even the idea of trans equality have grown exponentially, fueled by finance from US alt-right fundamentalist Christian groups. Their ultimate aim is to remove women's reproductive rights by using trans people, and especially trans kids, as a wedge issue, as in a recent legal attack in the UK, which succeeded in stopping medical treatment of UK trans children for months. I mean, just so devastating. And you can see here the consequences of this government anti-trans support. So a massive increase in trans hate crime. And of course, all of the things that you would expect if you were still socially excluded to a degree. So much higher levels of homelessness, for example. And disturbingly, at the moment, there's a pattern emerging of a relationship between white supremacism and transphobia. Now we can see this happening in early colonialism from the 1400s onwards, and especially from the 1600s onwards. And early colonialism classified people in categories, and in the monster category they included people who changed their sex. We can see this system, a naturalized system, operating all the way through colonial history. And we can also see the same tropes used by colonial racism. If you just think about part 2 of W.D. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation, we can see those tropes being applied to trans people. The same tropes of sexual predation and disease and degeneracy and animalism. So that the notion in the UK very strongly is we have people saying very openly in the media that trans people aren't real people. A trans woman isn't a real woman, and a trans man isn't a real man. And as soon as we decide that some people aren't quite human, then history tells us what direction that takes us in. So this is really quite disturbing. We also see that we've got the same language of masquerade, passing, being read, stealth, and the implications of furtiveness, and the same exaggeration of physical characteristics used in lampooning. So the emphasized eyes and the lips and the movements, all aimed to show that, trans men aren't really men and trans women aren't really women, in the same way that, all the awful blackface minstrelsy stuff was demonstrating that African Americans weren't real people. So just dreadful, honestly, so dreadful. Interestingly too, and equally disturbingly, we can see this white supremacist anxiety about replacement theory being mirrored by TERF anxiety about what is no more than the increased visibility of trans boys. But this is being presented as social contagion, girls being contaminated by a cult of being trans. And meanwhile, the reality is that trans people tend to be represented disproportionately in areas of social deprivation, such as homelessness and social marginalization, such as in the sex industry. So trans people today live the consequences of Ewan's case, unintended by him, but nonetheless real, painful, and degrading inequality. And for me, that's why I wrote the book, because I think that knowing this history is important, because in a democratic society, none of us are equal until we're all equal. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
All right, it looks like we have a couple questions from the audience. A reminder that you can submit on the toolbar anytime. So the first question is, the court outer house of the Court of Session sitting under Lord Hunter found that Ewan Forbes was a hermaphrodite with male characteristics. Hunter ruled that hermaphrodites, intersex people, were to be assigned to either the male or female sex. Hunter stated that there could be no legal loophole for transsexuals to use. So how could the case threaten primogeniture or monarchical succession? The judgment was that Forbes was male.
Oh, well, because Ewan was trans, and the judge knew perfectly well that he was trans. Ewan's own medical expert said he was, and everyone knew that what Ewan did was to present falsified medical evidence in court, and that was the problem. Yeah. And in fact, Lord Hunter speaks out against, he says, some people who have spoken blithely, I think is his term, committed perjury blithely. He knew that Ewan had lied in court.
All right. And I guess just another reminder to the audience to submit questions. So yeah, I guess we were talking before the event about having to deal with people on social media sort of reacting to your book. I was wondering if you maybe wanted to talk more about that.
Yes, it's sort of been an interesting reaction. You know, and obviously there are challenges in being first in field in writing this kind of social critical history of being trans. So a lot of the concern has been simple denial of historical facts. You know, things like saying, well, Ewan wasn't trans. Well, he was, you know, or trans people couldn't correct their birth certificates. Well, they could and did, and lots could and did, and so on. So there's this sort of stubborn will to non-knowledge of, you know, history and science. The notion someone else was concerned, they felt that the idea that all embryos start out as female and then either stay female or become male with, you know, a certain number of people caught in the middle, they felt that was dubious science. Well, of course, it's just science. So there's that sort of slightly odd difficulty with just coping with the facts. And then occasionally people will pick on the precise technical meaning of words, you know. And again, you know, when you're writing for a general readership, you do have to try to explain really quite complex things in simple terms. So, for example, I talk quite a lot about gender and talk about that in really very simple terms, which to any cultural theorist would say, oh yes, but there's far more to it than that. Well, of course there is. So what I did was to use the endnotes in the book to signpost people to books where they can kind of read more stuff and get an idea of what's being said by, you know, in more depth on those sorts of areas. So yeah, but it's remarkable really that people should be so upset by something that affects such a tiny minority of people and is obviously unequal. But there we are. It takes all sorts to make the world. I did my best on social media to have a conversation. It's very difficult to do. Social media isn't a great place for that. And then there was a point at which things got a bit angry and abusive. And so really at that point, you just have to end the conversation. That's all one can do.
We have a question from Emma. Dearest Zoe, do you believe humans have advanced in their way of thinking? Seems that there was a different level of freedom many years ago and interest in difference, and that perhaps we've gone backward in our inclusivity and ways of viewing individuals.
Yes, it is. I think that's one of the strangest things of all. And one of the reasons partly why I wrote the book was to say, look, you know, when Ewan was a kid, okay, he was very privileged in terms of gaining access, but actually being trans wasn't the kind of problem that it's been turned into. So what we have are manufactured problems. You know, we know that from, say, if we just, let's just go from when we have hormones being synthesized in the 1920s to the 1960s. Well, we've got nearly 50 years of trans equality, completely unproblematic. Access to medical care was, okay, the treatments weren't as sophisticated as they are today, and we certainly didn't have puberty blockers for all of that period. But still, the medical care was there, it was elective, you weren't psychopathologized and told that you were mentally ill, there wasn't compulsory sterilization, and there was equality. You could just simply correct your birth certificate. We had a department at the registry office that did that, and live equally. And so, yes, in that sense, things have very definitely gone backwards. And the damage was really done by John Money and Richard Green. And they were the two main people. And I should say right here that one of the things that's so difficult about this is that we think that monstrous things are done by monsters. Well, they're not. They're done by people who think that they're fair and reasonable and decent people. I knew Richard Green professionally, and I met John Money at conferences, and both of them were, you know, nice, sociable, affable, perfectly decent guys, unless you were their patient, in which case life might be a bit more difficult for you. So these things don't happen because there's not a central monster. The people who think that they're being fair and reasonable and doing their best. John and Richard thought that they were the good guys, you know, helping these poor deluded creatures and trying to help them just get some sort of a life. That's how these things happen. And I'm sure the people on social media who are anti-trans feel the same about themselves. Not many people think of themselves as a monster.
I guess the last question is, what's next for you? What are you working on?
Well, at the moment, I'm sort of interested in this intersection. We've never done very well on intersectionality in the UK. We lacked the black feminism that you had in the US. And I think that's partly why we've got so much trans exclusionary stuff being done in the name of feminism. I think black feminism kind of got rid of that in the US at a relatively early stage. So I'm interested in the way in which the narrative about trans people is paralleling the narrative about, you know, colonialism. And we can see, you know, I mean, there's lots of stuff in ethnography that just does, like, this is, for people who are interested in this stuff, this is Mary Louise Pratt, Imperial Eyes. It's a standard work on colonialism. But interestingly, by the time we get to 1914, we've got writers like Edward Carpenter, you know, the big gay liberationist at the start of the 20th century, producing his book, which is Intermediate Types Among Primitive Folk. And he's trying to say, if we go to simpler societies, then we'll find that actually there's this huge, not just tolerance of LGBT people, but actually they can often have a very high ranking function within that culture. And it's as though I don't know, as though we've turned into some kind of culture which has to have a scapegoat. Very strange. But I think there seems to be this pattern of ethno-nationalism and transphobia, but I don't say it's permanent and universal, but it is discernible. And I think that would bear some closer looking at.
All right, thank you so much to Zoe for joining us on At Home with Literati. A reminder to purchase her book. The link is in the chat. Have a good night, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Good night.